Okay, so I'm Logan. I'm a senior product designer at Noom, where I build products like these that help people with chronic diseases like diabetes or obesity reverse their illness by changing their lifestyle. I also lead a project called Flare Down that is basically like Google Analytics for unpreventable chronic disease. So sorry about that, I'll get better at that. It helps people recognize behaviors that are causing their symptoms so they can stop them. There are a ton of Noomers here, so you guys should talk to them if you're interested in what we do. So I've been doing behavior design for years now, but recently books like The Power of Habit and Hooked, I don't know if any of you guys has anybody read Hooked? Okay, cool, I figured. Have made this kind of a hot topic, right? And that is, how do we design products that genuinely help people to lose weight or like break an addiction or reverse a chronic illness brought on by a lifetime of bad habits. So the problem is, oh, by the way, I figure since you guys are designers, you're probably tired of good-looking presentations, so I made this with clip art from Google Images. So the problem is humans are lazy, right? They won't read more than a sentence worth of text at a time in my designs. They'll skip my beautiful tutorial sequence and get confused later on. Well, actually, humans are efficient. When we're faced with a decision, we have a couple ways to handle it. There's a very high energy conscious effort and a low energy subconscious response. So unless we're forced to do otherwise, our brains are going to use the low energy response. In behavioral psychology, these two modes of thinking are called System 1 and System 2, respectively. But there's also a famous metaphor for them called the elephant and the rider that I really like. So the elephant represents our subconscious thought process. It's instantaneous and low effort. It makes decisions based on past experiences and associations. So it's not always rational, right? We judge a book by its cover, or we like absent-mindedly drive to work when we are supposed to be taking the kids to school. But it's statistically right often enough that it's worth the energy savings. So that's why we kind of default to this mode of thinking. Now, most of the time, the elephant's going to make decisions for us. The rider, who's having a blast, represents our conscious mind. It's rational and intentional. It weighs the pros and cons of decisions, right? But it's very high energy and relatively slow, hence the phrase stop and think. So the rider only takes control when we're faced with a novel or complicated decision that our subconscious can't snap judge based on like past experiences or similar things. With that in mind, remember who you're designing for. Don't design for the conscious mind when the subconscious is going to be the one that's encountering your product, right? And most of the time it is. This is why in UX testing, it's even more important to watch what users do than to ask them what they think most of the time. Here's a drastic example. So the tweet is, no one understands the icon, the hamburger icon. Let's add the word menu under it. Oh, the word is too small. Let's add a pop-up calling it out. So the elephant is the one encountering the icon, right? We kind of subconsciously are browsing through, and it doesn't understand what that is. So time is trying to communicate to the rider, and it turns into a big mess. The point is, we aren't talking to a perfect rational being with our designs. We're talking to a part of the brain that is concerned with going places quickly and efficiently, sort of on autopilot, right? So how do we convince our efficiency-obsessed brains to go through a complicated and tough process like behavior change? Well, people are actually very motivated to change. We buy and read self-help books and return to the gym every January, even though we know it's going to suck, like last year. Behavior change products are compelling because people already want to change. But the process of behavior change is complicated and scary. We know this. There are lots of ways to fail, even after we've decided to do it. So luckily, behavioral economists have identified the thought process that leads to real action. So let's look at kind of you learn this with experience, but let's look at a framework for understanding that process that kind of makes it easy, proposed by Dr. Stephen Wendell, who is actually local and runs some meetups, which is really cool. So it's basically a set of barriers that we have to get our users past. And it starts with a cue. All right, so if you've read on this topic already, the cue is going to be familiar to you. It's inescapable in the world of behavioral psychology. The cue is the event that triggers the user to take action in the first place, right? There are external cues, like a push notification, or an alarm, or a call to action button on your website. And these are great because you can make one that's kind of unique to your product and own it, right? It's tough to set up, though, and make sure that the user encounters them, and they can cease to exist if the user's environment changes. Say I take a different route to work now, and I don't see your billboard anymore. You've lost your cue. There's also internal cues like hunger or boredom. So these are always present and hard to get rid of once established. And that makes them extremely powerful, but they exist in a crowded marketplace. If boredom is your cue, then you have to beat out Flappy Birds or Candy Crush. Good luck with that. So remember, you're going to lose people on this step of the process if your cue doesn't happen, or if you compete for your habit with a more powerful, if you compete for the cue, for the same cue with a more powerful habit. The next step of the thought process is the reaction. So this is the subconscious response that we have when we first consider taking action, and it's unique to each individual. And there are many, many factors that go into this, but a couple of especially important ones are how we frame the decision to take action, right? So it's been shown that people do not react perfectly rationally in decision-making, contrary to what we have thought for a long time in behavioral psychology. The same decision can be framed as a loss or a gain, or as optional versus compulsory, and people will choose very differently. It's been proven. The second thing is that social norms are very important. Getting fit, losing weight, it's an extremely socially acceptable thing to do, and it's actually a huge motivator, right? Whereas something like, say, talking openly about an addiction is going to be a lot harder to convince people to do. So remember, at this step, you'll lose people if they have a negative reaction to the actions you're asking them to take. The next step is evaluation. This is your conscious mind weighing the cost versus the benefits of taking action, right? So this is the extremely rational step. And we actually skip it in habitual or very familiar circumstances, right? It occurs, we go through this step in novel or complex situations. An example would be stairs instead of the elevator, right? Subconsciously, we're going to choose the path of least resistance every time. So that's the elevator. But the conscious brain can weigh the benefits. I'm going to get good exercise. The elevator is crowded. Versus the costs, it's only going to take 2 minutes of my time. And decide to take the stairs instead. So the conscious brain easily overrules the subconscious. People are actually very high willpower. It's kind of a misconception that we have about habit change. Most of the time, when we give into habit, it's actually because we don't notice what we're doing until we've already done it. And not because we couldn't stop ourselves. So you'll lose people at this step if the costs of the action you're asking users to take outweigh the benefits. At this point, our brain has decided that it likes the idea of taking the action that we're asking users to take, right? But the next question is, do we think we'll succeed? There's 4 basic ways to lose people here. So if you have no plan, users are not going to continue if they don't know where to start. If they're lacking the resources, they're not going to continue if they don't possess something that they need in order to take the action you're asking them to take. If they haven't been taught the skills, users are not going to continue if they don't know how to do what you're asking them to, right? And belief, and this is kind of a powerful one. If the user believes that they're going to fail or doesn't strongly believe they're going to succeed, they're likely not going to continue. The last step, now that we know that we can do it, is to procrastinate or put it off for later. Sorry, that's how you can fail at this step. This is urgency. So if your action is not urgent, we can put it off for later. And that's a problem because in the meantime, we might forget, or we might find an alternate action to take. For instance, we don't exercise now because what's the harm if we do it later, right? And then, it's late at night and I'll do it tomorrow and you never get it done. But we eat now because we're hungry, and hunger is a potent motivator. It makes eating into an urgent action. So like cues, there are internal and external urgencies. Internal would be hunger, fatigue, boredom. External is like a deadline from a boss, or it's getting dark outside, or something like that. Remember, you can lose users here if the action you're asking them to take can be put off. Okay, so this is the whole process. These are the 5 potential barriers to behavior change, right? The cue that makes us consider taking action in the first place, the gut reaction that we all have to that, the evaluation of the costs and benefits, the feasibility checks that we make to assess how likely we think we are to succeed, and the urgency of taking the action. Your product is going to be naturally strong and naturally weak in some of these areas. The trick is to find the weak areas and fix them. So let's look at some strategies to do that. The most straightforward approach is called supporting conscious action. And this is us showing the user how and why to make a behavior change so they can do it consciously. It's used in very novel or complicated actions that require a lot of thought, right? A good example of this is the Prius effect. So Priuses were some of the first cars to show you in real time your miles per gallon. And as a result, Prius owners overwhelmingly responded by developing efficient driving habits because they could see the direct results of their behaviors. They made a conscious intervention. The next strategy is to make or change a habit. So we use this strategy when an action isn't inherently urgent and we need to motivate the user. It's a must for repeated actions, right? And I don't want to go into too much detail because there's a whole topic and there's books and books on it, such as Hooked. But the basics are you have a cue, which we already talked about, that prompts the action. You have a routine, which is the action that the user is going to keep taking. And then a reward that teaches their brain to crave the habit, and that's how the loop gets started, right? So habits are nearly impossible to break once created. They can only realistically be changed. The last strategy is to cheat. That is, we use the strategy when all that matters is that you're getting your user to do the thing. You don't care that they're going through the process, right? So escalators would be a classic example of a cheat. We don't actually care about users going through the process of walking up the stairs. We just want to get them to the top efficiently. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff we just went through. Let's look at some real-world examples that use these strategies. Does anyone know Photocracy? Any users? Cool. That's more than last time. Photocracy's goal is to get you to work out, right? And they added social features to exercise tracking to kind of motivate people to do this. So your friends can prop you for your activities, and you can challenge them to one-up your records, right? So let's go through the process with them. Photocracy's cue is worrying about weight or appearance, feeling lazy, you got free time after work. Pretty good cues. Reaction is probably one of their strongest points, right? Being fit is as cool and like socially acceptable as it gets. So this is actually a huge motivator for Photocracy users. It's their biggest strength, and it's why people will put up with so much to go to the gym. Feasibility is, well, working out is hard, right? By definition, you're going into it to spend energy. It's not efficient. But again, the benefit is huge, and we know that people weigh the costs and think that it's worthwhile because they return to the gym every year, right? Now, the urgency is another kind of struggle for Photocracy. Unless they have a big life event coming up, it's easy for a Photocracy user to put off working out for now, right? And then they may never do it. So, Photocracy's weak areas are feasibility and urgency. So they use the support conscious action by introducing human coaches. The challenges for working out are like way too complex to walk through in just an app. And you need to learn correct form, how to use equipment, how to plan a routine, all that stuff. You also need to believe that you're going to succeed, right? Belief is important. And that's not easy considering all the complexity. So Photocracy had implemented like video tutorials, Q&As, groups with users, I think, and instructional guest posts, stuff like that. They even had gamified achievements to help you with the belief part of things. But in the end, it took human coaches to walk people through something as complicated as like working out and getting fit. And even more important, to provide motivation to keep up the urgency and get users coming back. So remember, supporting conscious action is great for complicated, especially tough, new experiences, right? As a strategy, it works best when your users are already highly motivated, as in like health and fitness, because it takes a ton of effort on the user's part to make it like a constant, conscious effort to change their behavior. But if you can pull it off, supporting conscious action can drive some of the most drastic behavior change. For instance, the case of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is almost entirely a conscious intervention to effectively stop intensely addictive behavior, right? Or Noom, where we use human coaches, just like photocracy, to reverse habits that are so ingrained that people will literally repeat them to death, despite knowing that they're preventable. Okay, so next example is Duolingo. Anyone use Duolingo? I'm a big fan. It's like a UX designer's dream, right? So Duolingo's goal is to get you to learn a language and to make it feel less like a class and more like a game. So they kind of gamified the process. So their cue is you're living in another country, you're traveling to one, or you just have sort of a passive desire to learn a language, right? These cues aren't very frequent, and that's kind of a problem for them. The reaction people have is that, well, people think highly of those who know multiple languages, right? It's a sign of intelligence. So that's a huge motivator. This is one of their biggest strengths, and it's why people will put up with the evaluation part of this, which is, it takes 15 to 20 minutes of heavy-duty thinking to really get something out of the product, and that's pretty big in digital product land. But the benefit of feeling accomplished and intelligent, or being able to communicate effectively with like a friend or loved one or a coworker, is well worth that input. And we know that because Duolingo is doing fine. Now, feasibility-wise, Duolingo's done a ton of work to make the whole experience very easy and guided. It's a beautiful app. And they make sure that you never feel like you failed, which is a really smart thing for an app that is testing your knowledge really frequently, right? And finally, urgency. This is one of their other problems. Any urgency comes from external sources, say an upcoming trip or a date. And these are not recurring things. It doesn't capture people who are passively interested in learning a language that well, right? By its nature, at least. So to fix the weak, infrequent cues and lack of urgency, Duolingo uses the create a habit strategy via gamification. So gamification is probably the most straightforward way to do habit creation, right? It establishes what I like to think of as like a shim habit. Gamification gives us a reward like points, levels, achievements, anything that is like quantified progress that helps us establish a habit using the cues and routines we want our users to follow, right? So once the habit is established, the reward can be swapped for a new one or even removed. Habits don't die after the reward disappears. Duolingo has like an XP progression system, you can see over there, and levels that show your prowess with different languages. So mastering a language is a huge reward on its own, of course, but it's such a long-term goal that they had to add these kind of intermediate achievements, right? So every time we gain a level, a little dopamine endorphin burst goes off, and it sort of solidifies the neural pathways that make up the habit, right? So that adds boredom to Duolingo's cues, because now it's like a little game you can play on the subway or anytime you're idle and you want that little boost. And once Duolingo had the habit established, it helped them with their lack of urgency, because the user has an internal desire to play now, not later, right? So you'll see these same feedback loops in social products like Facebook, where you post and get likes and eventually make a habit that is cued by encountering anything interesting that you could post about, right? So creating a habit is great for actions with a compelling reward, but a lack of natural cues or urgency. And remember that you can kind of create that reward via gamification if you don't already have one. Okay, finally, let's look at Instagram. I don't need to explain this. You all use it. Instagram has established kind of two main behaviors, right? So there's posting a picture and getting likes, and there's like browsing and liking photos to relieve your boredom, right? So we'll look at the posting flow. The cue for posting something is that something cool is happening or something I want to show people, right? It's a pretty strong cue. It doesn't have a lot of competitors and it's frequent. Users' reactions is that Instagram is cool and exciting, right? It's still relatively new and posting on it like makes you feel like an interesting person. Your friends are all doing it. It's very acceptable, sometimes even kind of feels mandatory social norm, right? So the evaluation is that the cost is just literally seconds of your time. It's totally free money-wise. And the benefit is social validation, like a big rush of endorphins when you see 50 likes on your photo, right? It's a no-brainer. Feasibility, also easy. We already have the phone and basic knowledge of how to use apps. And the interface is like a nice guided step-by-step. But belief is, again, the trickiest part. If the user is worried that the post will get no likes and you'll look like a loser, you're not going to post the pic. And finally, urgency. Insta also has kind of a weak point here. I can post whenever I want, and sometimes I forget to do it later. Right? It helps that it's so dead easy to do that I usually will if I remember. So you can make up for it that way. But as a side note, this is kind of where Snapchat has come in and taken over a bit. Users post much more content because it has to be done in the moment. And it doesn't have to be as high quality. This means that users interact with the app more, right? Which is a big win for Snapchat. So these weak areas in existing products can actually be kind of opportunities for other ones to come in and take part of the market. So Instagram's posting behavior struggles with feasibility, specifically the belief part, right? So here's the main issue. The user isn't a world-class photographer, but the content they're sharing is photos. So Instagram could easily be filled with like poor content that doesn't interest the browsing user and doesn't get likes for the posting user. And Instagram never gets the behavior that they want. But teaching every user photography is not something that Insta needs to do, and it would be realistically impossible, right? And we don't download the app to learn to be excellent photographers. So Instagram introduced filters, like we see on the right. Apply a filter to your photo, all of a sudden it's interesting and stylish, right? And it makes you look like you're living in like a nice hipster dream world, right? You feel good about your picture, other users see interesting stuff that they can like, and Instagram gets the behavior that they want. So cheats are really incredibly powerful when you just need the user to accomplish something, and don't care whether or not they experience the process. In fact, I'd say that when you can cheat, you should. The chief role of mobile apps in our lives is to kind of take things that we already do and make them easier, right? To cheat for us all the time. And if that can help a user fix or establish a behavior that will help them, it's an incredibly powerful tool. Okay, so let's kind of recap all this. To help a user change their behavior, get them past the 5 steps. That's the cue, the reaction, evaluation, feasibility, and urgency. This is the thought process that people go through when they take action. Every product is going to have natural strengths and weaknesses. So find your weaknesses and use one of the strategies we talked about. That's supporting conscious action, making a habit, or cheating to get your users past the tough stuff and help them achieve their goals. So if you find this stuff interesting and want to learn more, this talk is like the tip of the iceberg. There's so much to cram in. There's a mountain of info on this stuff, but here are some of the books that are specifically geared toward product. Also, like I mentioned earlier, we are lucky enough to live in a city where Stephen Wendell, who literally wrote the book on the framework that I just presented, hosts a monthly action design meetup. So check that out if you're interested. It's really cool. And that is the basics of behavior design. We can go straight to questions, I guess.
So how do you apply these principles at Noom?
So the sort of basic process, kind of the easy thing to do, right, is to go through these. And like I mentioned, the first thing that you want to do is figure out where your strengths are that you can play to and where your weaknesses are. And it's usually pretty easy, right? So at Noom, what we found over time was that, so we had issues with hold on, let me go through them in my head. We had issues with the feasibility step, right? Because habit change for chronic illness is massively complicated to do, right? Losing weight, stuff like that, super tough. So we used to be kind of all app-based, and we had sort of an AI system that tried to deliver, what you should be doing at any given time and effectively personalize things for you. And what we found over the years was that that wasn't enough because these processes are so complex. So to fix that step, we brought in the human coaches that I was talking about, and they totally reverse that, right? They're able to adapt to any sort of user situation, set goals that are totally unique to them, and they also fixed our problem in the urgency step by they're constantly there motivating the user. Does that more or less answer?
So when you design a new feature, do you consider these principles?
I mean, not always. Not always. It's not like something we run through every time. This is kind of, and again, this is like a framework for thinking the way that somebody who has been in behavior design for a long time already sort of understands how users think, right? This is a nice process to go through, but a lot of it you kind of go through automatically as a designer in your head, right? The kind of cool thing is that this can be applied, it's very scalable, right? You can apply it to like a tiny little feature, potentially, and as you should, your product as a whole when you like first conceive of it or thinking about like what are my problems and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Do some of your insights come out from like qualitative or quantitative or both? How does that work?
Well, we're not Google at Noom, so it's mostly qualitative, honestly, and we have a fantastic UX team. Corinne is one of them. And so we do a ton of user research, and what that typically means is we bring people in, and like I mentioned in the slide, we watch what they do when they use our products, right? And that is typically more revealing to us than running an A/B test on the color of a button or something like that.
Are there any products that you feel like fulfill the process without having to resort to any strategies?
Boy, off the top of my head, no, I hadn't considered that. So I went through like a bunch of kind of examples when I was writing this talk to try to figure out, to establish the ones that I showed up here. And what I found was, and I doubt that any of these are like going through this framework, right, and like looking for their strengths and weaknesses. I don't think it's a super common thing for designers, but I found that all of them very clearly did apply some of these strategies, like I talked about with, Instagram cheats with their filters, right? I haven't come across a product that I didn't think sort of intentionally or unintentionally fixed their issues with one of these strategies for behavior change, of course.
You talked a little bit about
Gamification?
yeah. I was wondering if you could speak some more.
We're having mic struggles.
If you could just speak some more about how you integrate gamification into your, when considering behavior change.
Oh yeah, okay, so gamification is an interesting thing because the point of it is to establish a habit that's easily replaced, right? So for things where you have like a really long-term goal, like I want to lose weight over the course of years, or like learning a language is one of these things, and that's why Duolingo uses it. You need that kind of intermediate establishing of habits because it's going to take too long for your user to see rewards otherwise to make them in the first place. So gamification it's appropriate for products like that. And actually, sort of an interesting anecdote, at Noom, we used to have a gamification system prior to having human coaches. And we found that, a few people engaged with it, but like it didn't drive the kind of like behavioral change that we needed for these like really complex things. It in and of itself wasn't the reward that users were after. We actually ended up phasing out the gamification system. So it is good for sort of shorter term goals, right? It's kind of dangerous to have a product that is propped up entirely by gamification, right? Although we see it done successfully sometimes. I have a couple friends who are really into Swarm, right? And that is just gamifying the real world, as far as I can tell. It is a hard thing to do effectively. Yeah, I'm sorry, does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, let's chat afterwards about it.
You mentioned gamification and human coaching as ways to overcome that feasibility barrier. Have there been any other techniques you've used and then moved on from as you've evolved Noom?
Not at Noom. Those were the two main ones that I saw, but I think I mentioned Fitocracy. They first tried to kind of tackle that problem by, actually, we did sort of do this at Noom. Groups of users, right, that can answer each other's questions. And we know this works sometimes, right? So you have things like Stack Overflow and internet forums where other users kind of are experts and can help each other out, right? And it actually works really well in some cases. I haven't really thought through specifically why it works well in that case and not others, but Photocracy went to human coaching. We went to human coaching despite having kind of like groups that help each other out. Other things were like straight up tutorials, right? Photocracy, I think, had video tutorials that would show you like, how to do all the lifts, stuff like that. So there are these kind of, it's often the really conscious sort of, here is how you do X thing, like a written out tutorial for it that people try to tackle this with. Hit and miss whether it like works.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about gamification, and I was wondering if you do you look at video game design ever to take inspiration for these sorts of things? So like, sort of the way like World of Warcraft will, set up a Skinner box and set up all these habits.
Right. I haven't personally done that. I love video games, by the way. And they're probably the best at it. So I think that would be a fantastic source of information. I haven't actually like looked at a video game and said, okay, how did they make their habit loop? And then, tried to apply that to a product. But you see it a lot, right? Duolingo is a fantastic example. It's like, want to get people to learn a language? Let's literally turn it into a game, right?
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions? Thank you.
Thank you, guys.